So if you've shot a lot of film, or you've studied zones a lot, or maybe you just watched my recent video on the least known secret in photography, you know that exposure is pretty relative. But what you probably aren't doing if you use Lightroom, Capture One, or a raw editing app of pretty much any kind is that exposure slider is not the only way, and not even necessarily the best way, to edit exposure. And today we're going to look at manipulating the tone and the shadow of that exposure in an easy way that's completely independent of the exposure slider. In fact, what I'm going to show you today is inspired by film in the darkroom, and it can give you more nuance and control over your tone really easily. Kidding. I'm not throwing this. I'm not Mr. Who's the Boss. I don't just have unlimited prompts. Most people don't realize that this concept of the exposure slider was not always a thing. In fact, long before Lightroom in the early days of Photoshop, to adjust exposure, we use curves and levels, and you lift it. Essentially, what you're doing when you adjust exposure digitally is you're pushing the gain of the pixel up or down, much like the EQ on your boombox from the 90s. Okay, maybe you didn't have that. That curve goes back to the film days and how film curves works. And it goes to how we edit pretty much everything. You're essentially pushing up or down the volume of those pixels. Here's a sunset I did up by Clear Lake. This is the raw file. Now, I could come in here and maybe I would go in and say, hey, I'm going to do kind of an HDR edit. Let's go straight to a preset from something like natural HDR. Okay, it's fine. I'm bold. I'm saturated. I could mix this in different ways, and I have a lot of dynamic range here. But let's reset this, and let's say I wanted to go with something a little more natural. So I'm going to go to Filmus 2, and I'm going to put something like Provia on this. Again, you can edit these however way you want. I'm just giving you some examples so you see the shadow and the intensity of things. It's important to understand that an exposure can be lighter or it can be darker, and neither one is wrong. The idea of correct exposure is a fallacy. The correct exposure is what you are visualizing. I could go to the exposure slider and just turn the exposure up. And generally, the exposure slider is going to kind of balance everything up in a relatively good way. Unlike the brightness sliders of the early days of photography, where it just kind of turned everything up equally. This is essentially an algorithm. So if you use Lightroom, it has its exposure slider algorithm. If you use Capture One, if you use anything. Now let's set this back to 0 for a second, and let's go down to curves. If I were to either go to the point curve and move it up and down, or even just go to the parametric curve, and let's say I increased all of these by 20. I'm essentially equally lifting all those elements and giving an exposure increase. The reason that's important is twofold. First of all, there's nothing wrong with the exposure slider in Lightroom, Capture One, etc. And for doing a general correction of your shoot, this one's a little dark, this one's a little light, the grid edit for workflow, they work perfectly. But if you understand that an exposure slider is really no different than using curves or another tool to lighten and darken, to push up or pull down the gain of your pixels, you understand that there's different ways to ride that horse. Is that an expression? Another important thing is if you're making workflow tools. When I design presets, if you use any of my presets or even my free presets like from the Filmus pack, you know that they never touch exposure. This is really important for workflow, because if you're doing workflow, and whether you're downloading presets or making your own to increase your workflow, making your own Capture One styles, etc., if that preset touches exposure or white balance, that's generally a sign of an amateurly made preset, because it's an inconsistency that won't work across all photos. The locked in white balance on one image is going to look terrible on another. Let's say you tried to warm it up and you're like, oh, I'm going to make a warm tone preset. You go to apply that to another image and it's actually going to be a cool tone preset. It doesn't work that way. That's not how you create a warm preset like I do in Gold Chrome or something like that. The same with exposure. If you take a preset that, let's say, is a portrait look like I do in Filmus, but it lightens up the exposure because you want a little bit more of a lifted, boosted, pushed look, because you've imported that session, and hopefully before you go to those detailed edits, you've already gone and done a grid edit. You've pushed one up a third, you've pushed another down a third. You've done those basic adjustments that allow you to have a consistent looking exposure. So the preset needs to assume that your exposure is correct and not erase settings like exposure and white balance that you've done before. But the other reason is the kind of exposure you want to lift. So let's go to exposure, and I can push this, I say 0.66. It's doing its algorithm and lightening everything up a little bit. That's fine. And then I could think about pulling down the highlights. Now, the reason I actually discovered this technique is in making things like Filmish, where I'm like, no, I want to push preset that doesn't adjust exposure, so it's independent, it works really well, but also I want to push preset that is more like film. What do I mean with that? Well, this uses the parametric curve. Look what's happening. Instead of increasing everything equally, this pushes the exposure more like if you actually pushed a film from, say, ISO 400 to ISO 800. It's going to have more effect on highlights than shadows. It's going to give you more of a film-like rhythm. So I could also pull this in the same way, but that wouldn't work with this particular image. So when I push this way instead of with the exposure, now if I turn this up or down using the adjustment slider of the amount, I can see kind of how that effect works. Here's 0, here's pushing up, up, up. And you can see as I progressively push this up, our highlights are getting more intense and our shadows aren't lifting quite as high, much like if we were pushing a film negative. Now you might say, oh, I want everything to push up evenly, and that's fine. You can make this look however you want and still operate independently of an exposure tool. And where this is going to really serve you is find the way you like to push or pull exposure and save this as a preset or a style. If I want to push this way, I'll go straight to these presets I've made for it. And you might want to push or pull a different way that affects the contrast in different ways, and you can make your own. You could save this as a preset, whether you're in Lightroom or Style and Capture One, and only select that part of the curve. So in this case, I'm only editing with the parametric curve, and then I would save that as a preset or a style. Now, I don't want to leave you Capture One users out. A quick tip, because you might be saying, hey, this is different in Capture One. And it is sort of. You don't have the parametric curve in Capture One right alongside the point curve. And so you can do all these things I'm talking to you about in the RGB or the Luma curve and then save those as a style, but then it's going to save all the curve settings. You can manually code presets. That is, you go into the code of a style in Capture One and you remove parts and adjust parts so it's only affecting, for example, the Luma curve and leaving the color curves alone. This is actually what I do in my presets when I have a preset in Lightroom and I want an equivalent style in Capture One. I will sometimes do manually coding so that they really work out really close. But remember that in Capture One, you also have levels. So you could actually do this with levels as well by darkening shadows, lifting midtones, highlights, etc. There's different ways to approach this, and then you could save that as a style that only affects that element, and now you can apply that to anything you want. Now I can, instead of pushing an exposure slider, I can get the more nuanced effect that I like to use and how it affects tone while leaving everything else in my settings alone, including other exposure settings that I might have done previously on import or something like that. Here's this very backlit kind of moody portrait of our model here, and you can see we're all at 0. I'm going to go and I'm going to do something like a Portra 400 film. Okay, fine. Let's pull this. This is the interesting thing, going back to what is the right exposure, and it doesn't exist. If I pull this, I make it darker and it still works. If I push this, I make it lighter and I kind of lift those shadows. They're a little bit more muddy, but they kind of have this organic feel, and it still works. So if I push this a little bit, you can see how I'm getting my own formula for how it's affecting the lights, the darks, and the shadows. I've made two snapshots. One is an actual 2/3 stop exposure slider increase. That would be this one. The other one is my film styled push that's using the curves. And you can see how even though these are both lightening relatively equally, there's a difference in the way it shadows. Notice how on my film emulated push, the darker shadows are remaining while the highlights are being pushed up, because I'm trying to emulate film in this and get a chemical-like effect, and that's what happens when you push film. A street kind of scene where they're sorting the newspapers, right? You can see that this is raw, no edits here at all, raw out of my X100, okay? Now, this kind of lacks contrast. It seems maybe a little underexposed, depending on how you look at it. So rather than apply a filter preset like a film or an HDR or a black and white, I want to see what just the pull and push. I can pull And if I pull, let's look at what it does. I'm using the preset so we can be consistent, but here's what's actually happening if you want to replicate this on your own. We're just adjusting these curves. Now, in Capture One, it will be slightly different in terms of, in Capture One, the curves are slightly different, but you can still do this very same thing. In fact, in my Capture One styles version of these presets, you have the same preset if you're using those. Notice how in the pull, I'm pulling down highlights, darks, and shadows a little bit differently to kind of give this formula. But this one's a little dark. Let's actually push this. Here's pushed, and you can see, just like pushing film, I'm pushing the lights a little more and the darks and the deep shadows a little less. So what we're actually doing is we're lightening this, but we're creating contrast at the same time. Again, I've made a snapshot here. So right now we're on the film it push. This is a 2/3 stop push. They're both lightening it up, but the exposure slider is just more of a general purpose, lighten everything kind of more or less equally, but not exactly. Whereas the film it push is using the curves and it is pushing it up, but it's having more emphasis on the highlights and in how it affects the shadows, which is creating contrast. But what I'm really getting at in this video is nothing is absolute in tone, shadow, and exposure. And if you want to understand that more, I'll put a link to my free live Shadow Hackers workshops where we dig a little deeper into this. But here's the thing. The bottom line is you can make an push or pull an exposure preset or style for your workflow that does not use any exposure settings. So number one, it's going to give you a more precise, personalized control over how you like the shadows, midtones, and highlights to be pushed and pulled, but it's also going to give you a way to quickly adjust a photo or group of photos without affecting the pre-adjusted settings that you might have applied in a batch edit with exposure adjustments or something like that. And that is actually really powerful and really important in a speedy workflow. I can edit a session of 500 photos, including sorting and everything, and have them ready to go to a client in an hour. And I could edit a wedding and have it ready to go to client in 3 hours. How much time are you spending when you edit those kind of things? And I'm always looking for little ways not only to increase my style, my personalization, and my creativity, but also to increase the workflow. So don't be afraid to just use all the tools in whatever app you're using. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hit that like, subscribe button, come back for more. I will put some links in the description to some of the things I mentioned, including some free presets and a link to my free Shadow Hackers workshop if you want to talk more about this concept of tone and exposure. But for now, go do some custom exposuring of your own, and we'll see you next time.